same thing that happened here happened there. I don't think the first Nakba happened 76 years ago. First Nakba happened maybe 1 year before I was born. I have friends that are Jewish, Semitic descent, Israelite descent, that all live in the North Americas because the IDF, the Zionists, are just like the Nazis. They ain't no different. Einstein didn't agree with them. Many Orthodox Jews didn't agree with them. Wake up. Wake up. You call yourself woke and you're supporting the Zionist IDF, you're fully asleep. Today is October the 21st, 2024. It is the first Monday in this 13th Tu'un of the long count calendar, which it seems the Sumerians used the Tu'un calendar, as well as other ancient cultures that white supremacists and black supremacists want to erase from history.
Zionist leaders were already saying very clearly in the 1920s, of course the Arabs will oppose us. And there's no peaceful resolution to this in sight, and the only thing that will decide this is superior force.
That sounds like Nazism.
That's Zachary Lockman, and this is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamia. This edition of AR features Zachary Lockman on a brief history of Zionism. Zion is the name of a hill in ancient Jerusalem. The Jewish nationalist movement coined the term Zionism in the 1890s. Zionism got the big power backing it was looking for when Britain issued the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917. Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, stated, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." This declaration became the major legal cornerstone for Zionist claims to Palestine. Two issues complicated things. At the time, 90% of Palestine's population was Arab, Muslim, and Christian, and only 10% Jewish. And the British were signing away land that was not theirs. Our guest today is Zachary Lockman. He's professor of Middle Eastern Studies and History at New York University. He's the author of many books, and he's contributing editor to Middle East Report. This classic from the AR archives was recorded at NYU in 2010. And now, Zachary Lockman, a brief history of Zionism.
I think we can see Zionism as one of a whole series of different and often conflicting responses by Jews in Europe, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews lived at the time, to the situation they found themselves in the late 19th century. The great majority of Europe's Jews and of the world's Jews at that time lived in Tsarist Russia, within the Tsarist Empire, where they were discriminated against, often persecuted as Jews, and were also extremely poor in their great majority. In the process of figuring out how to respond to this situation, Zionism was one tendency that emerged. There were lots of others, and others that were much more popular at the time and for decades afterwards. For example, from the 1880s onward, after the wave of anti-Jewish pogroms that erupted in Tsarist Russia, millions of Jews picked up and left. They voted with their feet, in a sense, and went to other places where they hoped they could live lives that were not subject to persecution and discrimination, and find economic opportunity, escape from the terrible poverty in which most Jews in the Tsarist Empire were enmeshed. And this is when we get the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States, and to a lesser extent to Western Europe, South Africa, Argentina, and so forth. And in this sense, Jews were part of a vast wave of millions of immigrants out of Eastern and Central and Southern Europe, most of them non-Jews, escaping poverty, seeking opportunity, in some cases seeking religious or national freedom. So this was one very powerful response. A great many Jews in Eastern Europe stuck to the old ways. They continued to live deeply religious lives. They felt that whatever they endured was God's will, and as long as they lived in accordance with the laws of the Torah, God's commandments as they saw it, this is how it had to be, even as they tried to get through day to day. In Russia and elsewhere, many Jews abandoned the old ways. They felt that the old laws, the old religious commandments, were no longer relevant to their new lives. This period witnessed the spread of education, urbanization, very rapid demographic growth, and many Jews escaped the tutelage, the domination of their rabbis and their close-knit, tightly controlled communities, and became much more secular, and sought advancement either through education, although that didn't get you very far in Tsarist Russia. There were limits to how far Jews could advance, or they turned to movements for social change. Jews were just one of many oppressed nationalities in Tsarist Russia, And, of course, the great bulk of the population were oppressed in class terms. The great bulk of the peasant population were ruthlessly exploited by their landlords and the urban working class, which was growing very rapidly. So many Jews joined the clandestine movements, parties, organizations that fought to end Tsarist oppression, to overthrow the Tsarist regime and create a democratic and socialist Russia in which Jews, with all the other oppressed nationalities, would have equal rights. And this is why Jews played a very disproportionate role, a very disproportionately large role in all the movements of opposition to the Tsarist regime, including the left-wing movements, the socialist movements, including ultimately the Bolshevik movement. If we look at the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, which brought the Bolsheviks to power in 1917, not Lenin, of course, who was the preeminent leader of the Bolsheviks, but most of his top lieutenants were Jewish. And this is because of the double oppression to which Jews were subjected in Tsarist Russia as Jews and as poor people, as poor working people. So we have a whole set of responses, ranging from the hope for assimilation through education, the eradication of anti-Semitism, to revolutionary change, to emigration, to sticking to the old ways. And of course, among all those tendencies, you have the emergence of Jewish nationalism, which comes to be called in the 1890s Zionism. And this too is not very surprising. If you look what goes on in Europe, across Europe, in the 19th century, this is the age of nationalism. This is the age in which one people after another develop new forms of national identity and come to feel that it's no longer acceptable for them to be ruled by people they come by empires, by states they come to see as alien and oppressive. And so in Italy, in Germany, in Greece, in Serbia, in Poland, and these of course are not nation states at the time, they're empires, they're ruled by others. You have nationalist movements which seek to establish independent nation states for this new category of people, which is usually defined by its language. Right? Before the 19th century, the idea that everybody who spoke German should be in one Germany would not have occurred to anyone. Or the idea that everybody who spoke Italian in all its dialects should be within one nation state called Italy, and that nation state should be independent of the rule of Austria or the other outside powers that dominated, would not have occurred to anyone. People would not even have defined themselves as Italian first and foremost. But in the course of the 19th century, this idea of nationalism spreads very rapidly and challenges or disrupts and undermines all the old multi-ethnic polyglot empires, the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, certainly challenges them and helps lead to their collapse at the end of the First World War. So it's no surprising in this situation that some Jews began to feel that what they too needed to escape from anti-Semitism, to achieve equality within Europe, was a nation state of their own. This was a minority movement. There were, before the 1880s, you can find a few voices who begin to talk about this. Most religious Jews had no interest in this because from their point of view, one had to wait, a proper Jew had to wait for the coming of the Messiah to escape exile, to escape persecution, and only when the Messiah came and the end of days arrived could Jews be restored to their ancestral homeland, the house of David would be restored, and we'd have what Christians would later call the kingdom of heaven on earth. So religious Jews were not interested in political projects
in the end of days
kind.
at all.
Certainly socialist Jews were also not interested. They wanted to change the societies they lived in so that Jews would have equal rights and better opportunities and be able to be full members of their society. And the many Jews in Central and Western Europe who had achieved legal equality in Germany and France and Britain and elsewhere also wanted to be part of their society. They wanted to be full citizens of liberal democracies. And the idea that they should pick themselves up and go somewhere else to try to achieve that seemed to them counterproductive or counterintuitive. In fact, it seemed to them to be accepting the basic arguments of the anti-Semites, who said that Jews were not part of European society or not part of German or French or British or whatever society, that they were aliens and didn't really belong. And that's exactly what many secularized, fairly assimilated Jews have been fighting to overcome. So Zionism is very much a minority movement. It got a little bit of traction in Eastern Europe in the 1880s and 90s as part of the reaction to the wave of anti-Semitic violence, aided and abetted in many cases by the Tsarist government, which was quite viciously anti-Semitic. And you begin to have in the 1880s, 90s, small groups of people who begin organizing themselves, raising money, and trying to plan the emigration of Jews out of Eastern Europe to a place where they can create a homeland of their own. Now, for most of these people, the only place that makes some sense to them is Palestine, the land of Israel, which has very powerful religious resonance, certainly for religious Jews, but even for Jews who have left religion in the strict sense. This was the place where, for Jews, the events of the Bible took place, where the events of the Jews when they had sovereignty were located. So it was not surprising that you have small groups of people who pick themselves up and try to establish agricultural settlements in Palestine, which is then part of the Ottoman Empire, with the hope of thereby launching an effort to achieve the national rebirth of the Jewish people, national redemption. It's a small-scale project compared to the vast numbers of Jews who emigrate and go to the United States or go to Western Europe. It's a drop in the bucket. It's a tiny, tiny minority. It's a couple of percent of that wave of out-migration from Europe. But it's there, and they do establish in the 1880s and 90s some numbers of new agricultural settlements because they very much want to become rooted in the soil. They feel the Jews should be sort of peasants, and you can see the influence here of a certain Tolstoyan romantic nationalism. They want to be rooted in their ancestral homeland. That's where they can connect to the land that was theirs once and which will be theirs again, and thereby be the vanguard of this project of national rebirth. Their numbers are small. We're talking some thousands of people. Zionism becomes a modern international political movement only at the very end of the 1890s. And here the figure of Theodor Herzl is crucial, who was a Viennese journalist, actually of Hungarian origin, but moved to Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, made a name for himself as a journalist and a playwright, very assimilated, knew almost nothing of Jewish tradition, from a non-religious family, but by the mid-1890s came to feel that anti-Semitism was not eradicable. It could not be eliminated. Partly he got this from covering the Dreyfus trial in France in 1894 as a journalist for a Vienna newspaper, and it was a big shock to him, although he'd already been moving in this direction, to see French mobs in the streets chanting death to the Jews. And this was in Paris, which was the homeland of the Enlightenment, where the principles of the French Revolution had supposedly taken root, where Jews had full political equality, were full citizens, and yet anti-Semitism persisted. So Herzl latched onto this idea that the only solution to the Jewish problem was for the Jews to leave Europe, or leave wherever they emigrated to, because he argued wherever they moved to, even if they moved to the United States, in a sense they would cause greater anti-Semitism by their presence. And in the end, this would lead to discrimination, tension, friction, exclusion, so they'd simply have to move onward. So for Herzl, the only way out was to have the Jews move somewhere where they could become a majority, where they could achieve a state of their own ultimately, and then, with a state of their own, would be accepted as equals by their fellow Europeans. And even if some stayed behind, they would then be like expatriates of any other country, and they would have a basis for equality. And it was Herzl who turned what had been a sort of amorphous, underfunded, not well-organized network of sort of local Zionist societies in Central and Eastern Europe into a well-organized, highly institutionalized, and quite effective political movement. He convened the first Zionist Congress, a meeting of delegates from across Europe, in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. That the new Zionist organization he founded, and which he led for the years until his death, developed all sorts of institutions. It developed financial arms. It developed a land purchasing agency to buy land for Jewish settlement. And he took it upon himself to represent the Jews. He in effect declared himself the sole legitimate representative of the Jewish people, and went from European capital to European capital trying to convince the powers of Europe to facilitate this project, to sign on to this project, to get for the Jews some piece of land somewhere in which they could establish their homeland. Herzl didn't care very much where that was. If you read his pamphlet, The Jewish State, he talks about Argentina as well as Palestine, because at the time many Europeans saw Argentina as this vast empty place which was suitable for European settlement. And in fact, some Jews were going to settle in Argentina at that very moment. So he wasn't that concerned, but within a couple of years, the Zionist movement fixated on Palestine because it was clear nowhere else on earth had the kind of emotional resonance and historical depth of connection for Jews than Palestine again, and the land of Israel, which Jews, whether they were religious or secular, conceived of as their ancestral homeland. So you have the launching of this movement, which is trying in terms of its day-to-day actions to get Jews to move to Palestine, settle there, create new settlements, new towns, and also claiming to act politically on behalf of the Jews. Now, it's important to remember that when Zionism emerges as an organized political movement around 1900, the last years of the 19th century, the first years of the 20th century, it's rejected by most Jews. Religious Jews rejected, Orthodox Jews rejected, because for them it's a false messianism. It's what Jews, from their point of view, need is not a nation state. They need to live according to God's commandments, which one can do anywhere. And again, await the coming of the Messiah for the eventual return to the land of Israel. And any human action is a way preempting God. It's doing something which only God can do. So the Orthodox rabbis condemned Zionism at its origins very, very vigorously. They denounced the Zionists as idolaters. They worshipped the state rather than God's law. They were secularizing. They were leading the youth away from religion, which they also didn't like. They were substituting the nation for God's law. So Zionism was rejected from that quarter. It was rejected by most secular assimilated Jews in Western Europe, who again saw this as feeding into the arguments of the anti-Semites. They wanted to be equal citizens of Germany or Austria-Hungary or France or Britain. They didn't want to have to pick up and leave, and they rejected the notion that they should. And similarly, Zionism was rejected by the many Jews who were attracted to socialism, especially in Eastern Europe, who felt that Zionism was a sort of crackpot idea, a pipe dream, and that instead of running away to Palestine, Jews should stay and fight for their rights wherever they happen to live, and demand equality and demand the transformation of society such that there would be a society of justice and equality, a society of socialism, in which Jews could live along with non-Jews as decent human beings and have their own particular cultural distinctiveness recognized and supported instead of suppressed. So Zionism remains very much a minority movement among Jews for many decades, and really down to the Second World War, down to the end of the Second World War. And there were many other currents in Jewish life which were non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. In Palestine itself, which is the focus of the Zionist movement as it gets organized, its successes are limited. It does succeed in the years leading up to the First World War in bringing under its auspices some thousands of Jews to settle. Some in new agricultural settlements of various kinds, some in the towns. A new Jewish town, which will eventually become a very large city, Tel Aviv, is founded around 1909 as the first exclusively Jewish city in Palestine. But it's a slow process. It's sort of acre after acre, immigrant after immigrant. Its prospects for success still seem very limited in 1914. And largely because the Zionist movement is much less successful at getting a big power sponsor. Palestine is part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman government in Istanbul has lost a lot of its territory to foreign encroachment. It's very sensitive to what it sees as outsiders coming in and talking about taking away some other part of it, and especially Palestine, which for Muslims, of course, also has a lot of religious resonance. The Ottoman government sees these Zionist immigrants not so much as Jews, but as Russians. And Russia is the traditional enemy of the Ottoman Empire, and it doesn't like these Russians coming in and claiming the protection of their ambassadors and their consuls against special privileges. So the Ottomans are trying to stop the Zionists from buying land. They're trying to restrict immigration. After 1908, when there's a constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, there's suddenly a free press, there are elections to the Ottoman parliament, and you begin to have Arabs in Palestine taking note of this Zionist movement, raising objections to it. You begin to have local conflicts over land ownership, because as the Zionist organizations, or as Jews buy land, the peasants who live on that land are being dispossessed. They're protesting. So you already have calls in the Ottoman parliament on the Ottoman government to restrict land sales, to restrict immigration. It's becoming an issue already. The Ottoman government has no interest in a Jewish state in some part of the Ottoman Empire, or even a Jewish majority in Palestine. And Zionism, despite Herzl's efforts and despite the efforts of his successors, also don't succeed in selling the idea to any big power in Russia, in Europe, without whose support they're not going to get very far. They lobby the British government, the French government, the German government, the Russian government, on and on. But they all see this as not a very likely prospect. They have other fish to fry. They're not very interested. So if you look at the situation in 1914, Zionism's prospects for success don't seem very large. Palestine is overwhelmingly an Arab country, and the great majority of its Arab population is Muslim, with a Christian minority. Increasingly, its Arab population are coming, or at least the more educated, urbanized elements, coming to see themselves as Arabs also in a new national sense, because nationalism is also penetrating the Middle East. And as the Ottoman Empire is getting increasingly decrepit and creaky and unable to protect itself, some of its constituent peoples, including both Turks and Arabs, come to see themselves a little less as Ottomans and a little more as Turks or as Arabs. So there's a growing sense of not quite an Arab nationalism yet, but of an Arab identity, which doesn't accommodate Zionism, of course, which sees Palestine as Arab, as it is, in fact, demographically, and has been for many, many centuries, and sees Zionism as a threat, still a distant threat. It's hard to imagine that there could be a Jewish state given the small size of the Jewish population, not all of whom are even Zionists, but it's becoming an issue, and there is a heightened sense of Arab identity, awareness, self-definition by 1914 already. The First World War changes the situation pretty dramatically, because the Ottoman Empire ends up joining Germany and Austria-Hungary in the war, because their main threat is Britain and France, so it's not surprising that they ally themselves with Germany and Austria. Britain has taken over Egypt next door. France has designs on parts of the Middle East, so the Ottomans feel Germany is a much better bet. Germany has no colonial ambitions in the Middle East, as Britain and France do. But that turns out to be the losing side as things develop. And by 1917, British forces invading from Egypt are conquering Palestine from the Ottomans and heading north along the coast. And the First World War gives the Zionist movement the opportunity to find the big power sponsor it had been dreaming of since Herzl's time for the previous 20 years. Herzl dies early on, but his successors continue his efforts. And in 1917, the British government essentially endorses the Zionist project. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, issues what becomes known as the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government officially endorses the idea of creating in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. The formulation was deliberately vague. The British spent a lot of time thinking about the wording, and they wanted to fudge it as much as possible. At the same time, they were making other promises to Arab nationalists who had revolted with British funding and military support against the Ottomans, and had promised the Arabs to help create an independent Arab state after the war, which the Arabs thought included Palestine. And at the same time, the British were making secret treaties with France and Russia about how to divide up the Middle East into new colonial spheres of control. So completely contradictory promises. The British created the greatest empire in the world, not by honest dealings exactly, but by doing just this kind of thing. From their point of view, the goal was to win the war, and whatever helped with that, they were willing to do. And after the war, they would sort out these contradictory promises. So they endorse Zionism, and when the war ends and the victors, the Allies, sit down at Versailles and work out the terms, They draw lots of new lines on the map. They create the Middle East more or less as we know it today. The modern states of the Middle East are drawn by the Allies after the First World War out of the remnants of the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And among other things, the British create a new entity called Palestine and say that the Balfour Declaration, their promise to support the Zionist movement in creating a national home for the Jewish people, whatever exactly that means, in Palestine, will be applied part of their mission, their commitment in Palestine. The British don't rule Palestine directly because it's a little embarrassing at this late date after all the talk by President Wilson of self-determination to just simply take over as a direct colonial ruler. They create a new system which is in reality a thinly disguised form of colonial rule, the mandate system. So technically Britain and France are mandatory powers, they're sort of trustees. And their job is to lead, in Britain's case, Palestine, eventually Transjordan and Iraq to independence eventually, and France is to lead Syria and Lebanon, which it gains control of towards independence. But in reality, the British and French are running the show. This is a tremendous victory for Zionism. It finally has the big power backer, and in the 20s and 30s, you begin to have migration on a larger scale into Palestine. So the percentage of Jews of the population in Palestine gradually increases. With setbacks, it's uneven, but you begin to get the laying of the foundations of a distinct Jewish society in Palestine. And of course, for Zionism, the goal is not to bring Jews to Palestine so that they assimilate into the indigenous Arab population. The goal is to create a separate Jewish society, and eventually a Jewish majority, and eventually a Jewish state in Palestine. So economically, politically, culturally, the drive is towards separatism, to separate from the Arab population, to build a whole Jewish society from, as the joke goes, from Jewish prostitutes, Jewish street sweepers, all the way up the social ladder, to the greatest extent possible, separate from the surrounding majority Arab society. And increasingly in the 20s and 1930s, this Jewish society, under British protection, creates the foundations, lays the foundations of a distinct Jewish society and even a future Jewish state, because this society has elected institutions, it has semi-governmental institutions, it has its own school system, it sets up its own military, its own paramilitary, the Haganah, which will eventually be the nucleus of the future Israeli army after 1948, and so on. It's an uneven process, and it's important, I think, to emphasize that none of this would have been possible without British support and protection, because the indigenous Arab population from the beginning, once the Ottoman Empire was gone, began demanding independence for Palestine and opposed Zionism. From their point of view, the British had come in, they had, and with a promise to give their country to these outsiders. So the Arab national movement which emerges in Palestine is vociferously opposed to Zionism, which they feel is aiming at reducing them to a minority in their own homeland. They feel this is a gross violation of the right of self-determination. They're the majority. Palestine should be an Arab state, and with Jews as a minority. And certainly without being open to immigration from the outside, which threatens to change the demographic balance. So Zionism, from early on, but certainly quite visibly in the 1920s and 30s, faces growing opposition from the indigenous Arab nationalist movement.
You're listening to Zachary Lockman, A Brief History of Zionism. This is Independent Alternative Radio. For copies of this program, call us 1-800-444-1977. We're online, our website, alternativeradio.org.
And it's only British protection that makes Zionism possible. The presence of a colonial government that's committed to fostering the Zionist project. Not always as much as the Zionist movement would like. There are tensions, but if we conduct a thought experiment in America in 1918, 1917, the British do not take control of Palestine, or agree that Palestine should be a state run by its Arab majority, it's clear there is no Zionism. That's the end of the story, because that Arab majority would simply put an end to this project, which threatens its presence, it threatens it with dispossession. And Arabs come to understand very quickly that, despite the nice talk of coexistence, and Zionist leaders talk a lot about coexistence, we can live together, there's plenty of room in this country for all of us. Inevitably, if you're trying to create a Jewish majority and a Jewish state in what is an overwhelmingly Arab country, this means dispossession. It may mean expulsion, but at a minimum it means dispossession. It means that the majority will be transformed into minority in its own homeland. And as many Zionist leaders acknowledge privately, if not always publicly, anybody would oppose such a thing. Right? Any indigenous population would resist such a thing. And the more far-sighted and hard-headed of the Zionist leaders were already saying very clearly in the 1920s, of course the Arabs will oppose us. And there's no peaceful resolution to this in sight, and the only thing that will decide this is superior force. So ultimately, we have to build up our strength such that we can overcome their resistance and carve out, by force if necessary, a Jewish state in this land, or transform it into a Jewish state, however long that takes, and by whatever means prove necessary. Most Zionist leaders were uncomfortable with that formulation, but I think that reflects the logic of the situation very clearly. And this is, I think, very graphically demonstrated in the later 1930s when, in 1936, there was a full-scale Arab revolt against British rule and against the Zionist enterprise, which British rule protected, which went on for 3 years and which was only crushed by the use of massive military force by the British, which in many ways broke the back of the Arab nationalist movement and set the stage for its defeat in 1948. But again, without British protection and support and military might, the growing Jewish community in Palestine, the Zionist project, would likely have gone down the drain or come to an end in one form or another. So by the late 1930s, Jews are an increasing proportion of the population, still a minority. They're a minority down to 1948. The Jewish population surges in the 1930s because of what's going on in Europe, essentially. In 1933, the Nazis come to power in Germany and begin stripping German Jews of their citizenship and persecuting them, discriminating against them. There's growing anti-Semitism elsewhere. In Poland, for example, which has a very large Jewish population, the largest Jewish population of anywhere in Europe. And of course, this is also the period of the Depression, when the economic situation is very difficult for everyone. And many Jews would like to emigrate, but they no longer can go to the United States or go to many Western countries. The United States closes its gates to immigration in 1924. There's a wave of nativism, of reaction to immigration, and essentially after legislation in 1924, you have to be from Scandinavia to get into the United States. It's very difficult for anyone else. The U.S. shuts the gates, and so does France and Britain to various extents. Whereas Palestine, at least, is relatively open. So a great many German Jews and Jews from elsewhere come to Palestine because they have no alternative. Even if they're not committed Zionists, this is where they can go to get out of the very difficult situation in their home countries. And so the Jewish population surges, which also sets the stage for the Arab revolt, because suddenly it seems to Arabs that this Zionist idea of a Jewish majority and Jewish state is becoming imaginable for the first time. It's no longer a fantasy which maybe will happen in several generations. Jews are now moving on a third of the population, and they're increasingly well developed. It's increasingly has strong economic foundations. Again, political institutions, military institutions, on and on. So it looks like a state in the making. And this touches off the revolt, the Arab revolt of 1936-39. The revolt is crushed, and in many ways ends up strengthening the Jewish community in Palestine, because it's forced into self-sufficiency, it's forced to develop its military institutions, it successfully withstands this revolt with British protection, of course, such that by 1939, the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, led by and part of the Zionist movement, is much, much closer to being able to stand on its own, which is very useful because in 1939, the British, understanding
that's what I would say from PTSD, people that are older than me, I'm
begins to
56.
distance itself from Zionism. It
I'd say
changes
World War
policy,
II ended in
basically says, look,
1972,
we've fulfilled our
common
promises of the Balfour
era.
Declaration. We've supported you in creating
And
a
when
national
Japan
home
came
for
to
the
do a
last 20
dedication,
years. But now,
the United
enough
States
is enough. We've done what we
didn't
said.
think that much time passed by,
We need to reconcile Arab
and they
opinion, which, of
miscounted
course, is deeply
lunar
alienated from the
months
British, and the
for
British
years.
need the Middle East. With the coming war, they need
And now
Arab
we said
support.
80 years
They need its oil resources. They need its strategic location.
instead of
So they back away from
52
Zionism.
years.
But by this point, in a way, Zionism has struck down strong enough roots in Palestine so that it can stand on its own, even without the kind of British support it had enjoyed for the previous 20 years. We then have the Second World War, which leads
Different
to the
theaters.
extermination of most of the
Different
Jews of
theaters.
Europe, which was the mass base
Second
which Zionism had always
Indochina.
imagined it would eventually bring to Palestine. And Zionism emerged with the argument
That's
that
what some
there
people
was no
call the
future for
Second World
Jews
War,
in Europe,
which
and
happened
ultimately they'd
concurrently
have to come to the Palestine where they could create a state of their
to the
own.
European Holocaust,
And even though only a
which happened
minority did
after
so,
and concurrently
they always imagined that
the
millions of
Mayan
Jews in Europe would be
Holocaust,
their future
which was
reservoir
still going on
for the
in
population of the future Jewish state.
1985
As the war
common
proceeded,
era,
the vast majority of those Jews were
39 years ago.
At the end of the war, Zionism found itself without that mass base, or a small remnant remained. This energized the Zionist movement in a sense, and during the war, for the first time, it began to state very unequivocally that it wanted a Jewish state. It had fudged the language before that, hence the sort of national home. They didn't want to alienate the Arabs or others by talking about a state too explicitly. Now, during the war,
The
they
theaters
began
got mashed up into
calling
one.
for a state. And immediately, once the war is over, launch a campaign, a quite successful campaign, to first open up Palestine to Jewish immigration, because the British have imposed restrictions, and then a drive for a Jewish state, which brings them into conflict with the British government. But the Zionist movement, for the first time, has won tremendous international sympathy because of the murder of the Jews of Europe. For the first time, its argument
severely concussed from cracked
seems
skull.
much more plausible to
But
a lot of
always
people.
tell me about the Belfort
Of course, there are other ways of understanding it, but for many people,
Maybe
it
5%
seems that
of our walks
supporting
were
the
about the
Zionist
Belfort
project of
Accord.
creating a Jewish state in Palestine is reasonable compensation for what the Jews of Europe experienced.
And only
The
one,
extermination,
pretty sure he told you about the Nakba many times.
and so
when I
there's
asked when I
growing
was
sympathy
freaking deadhead.
in the United States, especially, which is emerging after 1945, which does emerge in 1945 as the world's superpower, for Zionism, and pressure on the British to open up Palestine to more immigration.
And the Zionists have the same plan for every other ethnicity worldwide.
Campaign, lobbying campaign, but also in Palestine.
Because if they view it as if a Jewish person, wherever a Jewish person is, Israel is, that means if a Jewish person is living in the United States, their plan is to take over the United States eventually, take over Canada, take over Russia, take over India, Pakistan, take over China, etc., etc., etc. Think about it.
In the fall of 1947, that
most Jews do not agree with Zionists because Zionists are just like Nazis. They always make at least two solutions to get what they want.
Cannot live together in one
Zionism
state,
and Nazism are exactly the same.
Palestine into two states. So this is a tremendous victory for Zionism. Even if many Zionists would have liked all of Palestine or more of it, then the one half they were allocated by the United Nations plan, that's still much better than nothing. Right? Finally, the United Nations seems ready to support the idea of a Jewish state. Needless to say, the Arab majority in Palestine and the Arab national movement and Arabs everywhere reject this. Again, they see this as a gross violation of the Palestinian Arabs' right to self-determination and vow to prevent it. And when the United Nations General Assembly endorses the partition plan, fighting breaks out in Palestine between Arabs and Jews. By this point, the Jewish forces, the Zionist forces, are strong enough to both hold their ground and within a few months defeat the poorly armed, poorly organized, poorly led Palestinian militias and take the offensive. And in May 1948, the Zionist leadership in Palestine proclaims the existence of a Jewish state, which it names Israel. And that's followed immediately by the intervention of military forces from the Arab states to prevent partition, to protect the Palestinians, who are already being displaced, whether because they're fleeing from the fighting or because they're being deliberately expelled by the Jewish and then the Israeli military forces. When the fighting ends, Israel is in control of 3/4 of what was once Palestine. So a lot more, 50% more than the United Nations had allocated originally to the Jewish state. There is no Palestinian Arab state. That never emerges for a variety of reasons having to do with the ambitions of the Arab states. And 80% of the Arabs, of the Palestinians who lived in the territory that now becomes Israel, have been dispossessed. The great majority of them either have been expelled by Israeli military forces from their villages, from their towns, from their neighborhoods, or do what civilians do when there's fighting. They fled to get away from the fighting and then found themselves on the wrong side of the border. And Israel made it clear that they could not return and promptly began to demolish their villages, take over their neighborhoods, allocate their fields to neighboring settlements, and so on. And then so you have the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem through this act of dispossession, which many people have defined as an act of ethnic cleansing, in effect, although that term was not around at the time. So in many senses, this Zionism is as a movement a tremendous success. Right? From the sort of half-baked idea of these little groups in Eastern Europe, and the notions, the rather grandiose notions of a Viennese journalist in the late 1890s, to actually carving out a state in Palestine and being able to defeat opposition both internally from the Palestinians and externally from the surrounding Arab states, is a tremendous historical achievement for this movement, and helped solidify the support Zionism had won from many Jews who, until that time, including many American Jews, had been rather ambivalent. Reform Jews in the United States were very anti-Zionist, even later, but ultimately came to terms with it. Many Orthodox Jews who had originally been very anti-Zionist also came to terms with the existence of Israel, even if they didn't see themselves as Zionists. It was a fact. They became part of the new system. So from that point of view, Zionism was a tremendous success. The state which Zionism brought into being, the state of Israel, remains shaped by its origins, in a sense. It remains a Zionist state in some very concrete senses. First and foremost, Israel doesn't define itself as a state of its citizens. Right? The United States is a state of its citizens. If one comes to the United States, or one is born in the United States, and one becomes or is born a citizen, you, at least in principle, have equal rights with every other citizen. We know about racism, we know about the long history of the United States and struggles to actually make that real. But in principle, everybody who's a citizen of the United States has equal rights. And nobody who's not a citizen has special rights. And that's true of liberal democracies generally. That's one of the hallmarks of liberal democracies. Israel doesn't define itself as a state of its citizens. It defines itself as a state of all Jews everywhere. And that's embodied in various laws, such that, for example, any Jew from anywhere in the world who wants to come to Israel can become a citizen automatically. Whereas a Palestinian whose ancestors may have lived in this land for many centuries and who happened to be elsewhere in 1947-48 doesn't have those rights and has to apply through naturalization, and Israel has made it pretty clear it's not interested in any more Palestinian citizens. Israel sees itself as a state of all Jews everywhere. It claims to speak for all Jews everywhere, although not all Jews like that idea necessarily. Through that law of return, which grants automatic citizenship, through a whole range of state policies which seek to give Israel's Jewish citizens privileged access to resources, that special position for Jews within Israel is manifested. Something like 18% today of Israel's population, of Israel's citizens, we're talking about within Israel and its 1967 borders, are Palestinians, are Arabs. And they are the descendants of the remnant of the Arab population which remained within Israel's borders after 1948. So they are citizens formally. They can vote in elections. But it's very clear that legally and institutionally, in many ways, they're second-class citizens. Again, they don't have the same automatic right of emigration. The state has systematically, since 1948, pursued policies of, for example, transferring land from Arab ownership or control to Jewish ownership and control, confiscating land from Arab landowners for Jewish settlements within the state of Israel proper, a whole host of means which advantage one segment of the population and disadvantage another segment of the population in a way which would never be seen as acceptable in the United States. Right? If the government of the United States said, only Christian citizens can buy public land, people would think this is a gross violation of equal citizenship and oppose it. Right? Yet Israel privileges its Jewish majority in very structural sort of ways. If you look at the allocation of resources, Arab municipalities, Arab towns, Arab communities get far fewer resources for social services, for education, for a whole range of things than do equally sized Jewish towns, settlements, communities. All sorts of social benefits are allocated very disproportionately so that Jews benefit and Arabs do not, or benefit to a much lesser extent. And Israel has also worked very hard through its security apparatus to control its Arab population, to try to depoliticize them, to marginalize them, to make it more difficult for them to demand equal rights, as many have almost since 1948, and certainly more vigorously in recent years as their weight in the population, their level of education, and so on has risen. So in its symbols, in its language, Israel talks about itself as a Jewish state, and there's no way that cannot put its non-Jewish citizens in a subordinate position. And those non-Jewish citizens are increasingly resentful of that. And that's entirely separate from what happens in the occupied territories, what happens in the West Bank, Gaza, and so on, which Israel conquers in 1967. This would be an issue, even if that were resolved tomorrow, Israel would still face the issue of its Palestinian minority and the unequal status which that majority is subject to. So in these ways, Zionism still remains relevant, remains intrinsic to Israel's self-definition as a state and to a whole host of institutions, policies, and so on. It's this which sets the stage for debate which has gone on for quite a few years about whether Israel can in fact be both Jewish and democratic, whether there's not some contradiction here. If the state defines itself as Jewish, isn't it thereby inevitably subjecting its non-Jewish citizens to a subordinate status? Of course, if it's democratic, then it's not taking Jewishness or lack of Jewishness into consideration as a criterion for resources, for access, for a range of things, and then you have a very different kind of place. And in fact, one of the demands of Israel's Palestinian citizens in recent years has been that Israel should become a state of all its citizens, should become like the United States, where the government does not take religion or race, at least in principle, religion or race or ethnicity into account in terms of citizenship rights. It makes, at least in principle, no difference. We know, of course, historically it's made a lot of difference, and there's been an ongoing struggle to make that happen. But in principle, at least, that's the rule. That's not the case in Israel. The state of Israel classifies its population by nationality into Jews, Arabs, Druze, and so on. And until the last few years, this was stated on everyone's identity card. And it also classifies people by religion: Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Druze, etc. Your status, both your national status as defined by Israeli law and policy, and your religious status make an important difference in your access to things, to resources, in ways which would never be tolerated in the United States, which would be seen as fundamentally contradictory to the core principles of
legal
democracy
apartheid,
as practiced in the United States or in Britain or in France or elsewhere.
legal discrimination in the law in Israel.
In that sense, Zionism remains on the agenda, so to speak.
Worse than
It's central
Nazism.
to Israel's self-definition. It's important, of course, as well, because
Zionism
after
is worse
1967, when
than
Israel conquered the
Nazism.
remainder of
Worse.
Mandate Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, there began a project which has only accelerated over the years for settling these territories, for establishing Jewish settlements, for making them Jewish, in a sense, or many of them, despite the fact that their population remains overwhelmingly Palestinian. And the settlers and those who support them argue that, in a way, this is just the continuation of what Zionism has been doing for the last century. And there's a certain logic to that, which made them very difficult to confront, even by those Israelis who thought this settlement project was a very bad idea, and that Israel should be willing to trade the West Bank and Gaza for peace, make some kind of compromise, and divide Palestine with the Palestinians. The settlers and their allies argue that there's a lot of continuity here, that Israel should settle the West Bank as it settled parts of what became in Israel in 1948. And, of course, they have a certain biblical history on their side, because the parts of Palestine in which Israel was established in 1948 are not really the parts which were the places where the events of the Bible took place. Right? Those parts of the West Bank, first and foremost. So, especially for religiously inspired nationalist settlers, the West Bank is much more important than Tel Aviv. Right? The events of the Bible took place there. That's where Abraham walked. That's where all these things happened, according to the Bible at least. Reality, mythology, who knows? So there's also a lot of emotional, historical impetus to that. So in that sense, Zionism remains alive too, because it's used as an argument for the colonization, the Judaification, and that's a term which is used in Hebrew, both for these territories, but also for parts of Israel, of the West Bank. Gaza was always less important. It had no particular historical or emotional resonance, but the West Bank has been the core of this. And those who favor it have a lot of ground to stand on from within the Zionist tradition to argue that these lands should also be colonized, annexed, or at least in their important parts, by Israel, that they're part of the land of Israel, all of which should belong, or does belong forever to the Jewish people. So in that sense, too, Zionism remains very much on the agenda as a factor, an ideological factor, a cultural factor in Israeli Jewish society and politics. The question of Zionism is a very fraught one. It's a very sensitive one. I personally don't think it's been helped by the fact that there's a lot of crude Zionist bashing. Zionism has, in many circles, become synonymous with racism, with apartheid, the range of things. And of course, one can see the elements of Zionism, not as an abstract ideology, but in practice on the ground in Palestine, which support that. So I think we have to be careful, because for a lot of people, in the United States at least, for a lot of American Jews, I think identification with Israel is an important part of their Jewish identity. So I think one has to be very careful in dealing with this, because the way to win people over is to give them a better understanding of the situation. And just denouncing Zionism as racism probably isn't going to get you very far, as opposed to trying to find ways to reach people, to acquire a better understanding of what concretely goes on the ground, and of how those kinds of things, discriminatory practices within the state of Israel, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, all those things, have links to how Israel defines itself and how it sees itself, and to its origins as a Zionist state, as the product of a Zionist movement, which is comparable with all the differences to other kinds of settler movements, which bring people to settle and ultimately to take over from an indigenous population. So that's a very difficult thing. I don't pretend to know exactly how to do this as effectively as one would like. But I think it's also not an impossible task. And I think, in fact, the American Jewish community is much less monolithic, perhaps than it once was, and certainly than its leaders, self-appointed leaders, often like to proclaim it to be. And I think many have been quite distressed by what they see going on. Right? Israel has lately launched a whole new propaganda campaign, because I think they understand that the image of Israel has eroded a great deal, even in the United States, not to speak of Europe, where public opinion, I think, is much more critical, and governments have been much more critical. But even in the United States, and even among Jews, watching on one's television screen the Israeli assault on Gaza in December 2008, January 2009, was horrifying for a lot of people. And all the rationales that this is necessary for security, and if the Canadians were bombarding Maine, we would do the same thing, and on, don't sit well with a lot of people, and made people think, well, maybe the these guys are a little bit out of control, right?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
they're overreacting, or maybe something different needs to happen here. And that's created some space, and we see this with the emergence of J Street, and challenges a little more space that's emerged within the Jewish community on the surface, and I think greater space beneath the surface, which at least is a hopeful sign. It may not go very far. It's very difficult to predict, but I think there's a possibility of disentangling that emotional identification with Israel with support for Israeli policies, blind support for Israeli policies, and that's, I think, a hopeful thing.
You were just listening to Zachary Lockman, A Brief History of Zionism. This classic from the AR archives was recorded at NYU in 2010. Zachary Lockman is Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and History at New York University. He's a contributing editor to Middle East Report. This program is produced by Alternative Radio. We're an independent nonprofit in our 39th year. We're supported solely by individuals just like you. We feature such voices as Ilan Pape, Michael Parenti, Chris Hedges, Naomi Klein, and Arundhati Roy. To access our complete audio and book catalog, just go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website where we are podcasting, alternativeradio.org. For copies of today's program, Zachary Lockman, A Brief History of Zionism, and for Ilan Pape's book, 10 Myths About Israel, call us 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800-444-1977. Or go online our website, alternativeradio.org.
Cut off again.
PDFs and MP3s of this program are free of charge.
It wasn't
Just
because
call
of pure
us
connection.
1-800
Because it didn't lose freaking connections to TuneIn Radio.
1977. Special thanks to Will Singer. Joe Rich is our general manager and editor. I'm David Barsamia. Thank you for listening.
I'm just making a post here before I make a comment. I guess you can see it. Yeah, so that was Zachary Lockman on Alternative Radio, David Barsamia from 2010. That was over 14 years ago that guy did that lecture talking about Zionism. And a lot of people, if you talk to them and that know history, they'd compare Zionists to Nazis. What the Zionists are doing is exactly the same as the Nazis were doing. What the Zionists have been doing under Netanyahu since 1982 is exactly what the Nazis were doing under Hitler in Germany. If you freaking compare history back to back, what Netanyahu's been doing since 1982, the same year Hezbollah formed, is it Hamas or Hezbollah? Both Hezbollah and Hamas formed after 1982. If you review history, what Netanyahu is doing is exactly the same as what Hitler was doing. It's just been happening for a longer period of time. And my grandfather was talking about people saw things through history, a period of time when 6 million Israelites, Jews would be murdered, killed, right? Some people deny the Holocaust in Germany, so I wonder if World War II really ended in 1972 Common Era, like this weird memories I'm showing, and Vietnam ended in 1975 100% Common Era. It ended in 1975. That's what even general TV shows would show, like Tour of Duty that was on in the late 80s. 1975 Common Era is when Vietnam ended, which is called the Second Indo-China Armed Conflict. Now the problem with history is that they called Korea the first Indo-China armed conflict, but oddly enough, the first Indo-China armed conflict happened between Britain and China in the 1600s. So if Korea was the first Indo-China armed conflict, and Vietnam happened less than 40 years after it, what anno denominate years are we really in? ANNODOMINI, Latin, for years after the birth of Christ. From the Mayan factor, I'd say we're in 1768. From this factor, I just realized the other day, time of moonrise factor, yesterday the moon rose at 20:20 in the evening. It'd be 17 something. Moon rose yesterday, 2020. 1 week before that, it was 1659, and I had an odd recollection where we were talking about things we were supposed to do at this present time back in the past. So if William Shakespeare, if that was really William Shakespeare, like people used to argue in the 70s and the 90s, if that was really William Shakespeare that was injected, the second person injected in the British Isles, the coronavirus vax, when in the 70s it was known that people that had coronavirus associated memory loss needed a memory loss cure. And as far as I know from the memories that came back in Greek and Ojibwe, the cure for coronavirus was calisthenics, corona exposure, which means sun exposure, coronasphere. You need the lights from the sun, and cannabis. But the United States made cannabis illegal. In my recollection, my memory would tell me 1929 jumped to 1970s, mid-1970s. The Great Depression was the early 70s Common Era, as I remember it. My mom would tell me in the early 80s that people in English language are making up fake history. That's over 42 years ago. My mom was telling me people in English language are making up fake history to fool the world. The modern Olympics is done in the modern time since the Tunguska impact. No one knew the date on the calendar after that happened. Big Ben was hit with a boli and the clock had stopped. It was just recently repaired and painted back the proper color. Some people thought it was charcoal black with the clock heads on it, but it was actually midnight blue. Zionists are just like Nazis. A friend of mine tried to explain this to me when I was concussed many times. I recall that he talked to me about the Nakbar. And he is Sephardic. And we've sat down in front of people that are definitely Israelite descent, that seem to not be able to get citizenship to the country called Israel. But seems that people of European descent that claim to be Israeli have dual citizenship. The only place in the world you could have dual citizenship for? If you're European, you could have dual citizenship for Israel. But if you're from Asia, you can't. If you're from Africa, you can't. If you're from America, you can't. That sounds like Nazism disguised as a religion. That's why only a very small percent of Jews even believe in Zionists, because it is closer to Nazism. Real Jews understand that they should have been waiting for the Messiah to come to unite Jews, Christians, and Muslims under one banner of the children of Abraham. But the Zionists won't tell you that, because they're out for world domination in one religion. Cloudy.
right now it is 16 a.m. If you're outside, the moon is super high in the sky. And that will be that way this whole week. The moon will be up high in the sky. The rest of the week, you're outside around sunrise, look at it. And today the moon is setting after 1 a.m. That is October 21st, 2024.